Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. Just a quick note before this episode that I apologize for my audio quality here. It was a little echoey. This episode was recorded a while back, so just keep note of that. To sponsor an episode on the podcast or to support the podcast, please email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, or check out the link and information in the show notes below. You can also find the link to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Svarim, book deals, and more, as well as a link to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp status, if you prefer that way. And finally, if you can please subscribe to the podcast wherever it is listened to podcasts, rate and review the podcast, and with that, enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Berkovitz, and we'll be discussing his newly published book, which is titled A Life of Psalms in Jewish Late Antiquity, which is published by Penn University Press. I'm really talking about what it says, Tehillim, and a lot of different. We'll be discussing a lot of things about Tehillim, especially in the late Antiquity period, and we'll discuss when that is, Bisman HaMikdash, after the Bisman HaMikdash, Tanoim, Amoraim, really way back when, and maybe we'll get into some more modern stuff as well. So thank you, Professor Berkovitz, for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Nachi. This has been a real pleasure so far, and I'm excited for this conversation.
Okay, so let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Absolutely. So I am born and bred where all good Jews are, and that would be Brooklyn, New York. Born in Maimonides Hospital, because that's how specific we want to get, right? I went to Yeshivas Torah's MS Commandants for elementary school, Darchei Torah for upper elementary school, 6th to 8th, and Rambam Mesivta. A little bit of a change in pace for high school, to YU and then Princeton, fusing and meshing all sorts of different kinds of experiences.
How did you become interested in Tehillim? And I guess besides Tehillim, I assume you're also interested in like late antiquity, in the earlier Tkufas, the earlier periods. I guess do those two go hand in hand with your interest? And how did you become interested in that?
Absolutely. I love history. I hook, line, and sinker fell in love with history. So the combination of Tehillim and late antiquity, which we'll talk a little about soon, combines the love of both. Let's start with Tehillim. A small book. Some Jews may have heard of it. Maybe not. If not, well, you're in for a treat. But the Tehillim goes back to my mother, Allah HaShalom. She was one of those old school Tehillim zangers. Every single day, she'd say the, weekly, capitals. She'd finish the entire book. In, day out. She was actually nifter with Sefer Tehillim by her bedside. So the book is really, Sefer Tehillim has become just enmeshed in my own love of Yiddishkeit and, literally in the house in which I've grown up. And I only started to notice Tehillim when I was a teenager. Aside from davening Tehillim, which we kind of just breeze through, decided this is so important for my mother. Let's give it a shot. And I hope it's not kfiridik to say, it's really hard. There are some Tehillim that are amazing. Mizmor LeDavid, Gam Ke'ilech B'Gei Salmavet, right? Really beautiful stuff. And then some Tehillim were just impossibly difficult to understand. So I really wanted to appreciate and understand, what is my mother, right? Who's, Eastern European Jew, never got a formal Jewish education. What is she getting out of saying Tehillim? So that's the sort of Tehillim part of it. The late antiquity part of it is, if I really wanted to understand my mother and what it meant for her to say Tehillim, I'm a historian. I wanted to go back to the beginnings. And not just the beginnings of the book of Tehillim, but the beginnings of how the book was used. And to do that, I needed to look at late antiquity. That's the period of Chazal, right? The period between the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash in 70 CE and ultimately through the rise of Islam in 622 CE. It's in that formative era where our form of Judaism really, Chazal, right? This is when we become rabbinic Jews. But it's also the time where Sefer Tehillim really picks up steam and becomes a central part of not just Tanakh, but woof and worth of what it means to be a Jew and Jewish life overall.
Yeah, so that's something that's obviously going to be very important in your book and your articles, and you've written a number of articles, even more popular ones. So you talked about your interest in Tehillim, but how did you get into fusing the two together, focusing on Tehillim in this late antiquity period specifically? What I mean is, like, you focus on Tehillim first, like
in this period. Let's explain a little bit. Let's explain a little bit what that means. What does it mean when we're talking about Tehillim in late antiquity? What are you looking at, really? What are you really exploring with that?
Excellent. So the material for Tehillim in late antiquity is what Tehillim actually looked like and how Tehillim was actually used, right? We have a sense of, Sefer Tehillim during the times of Tanakh, but it's not until late antiquity where we actually get the stuff, the material of Sefer Tehillim. Its appearance in scrolls and magical amulets and inscriptions, and of course, the most central feature of what it means to do Jewish midrash, interpretation, right? It's, you have a little bit of it at Qumran with the people at Dead Sea Scrolls, but really the ikar, the central point in time where Tehillim starts to be understood as a text that is quite literally read and cried over and understood is Chazal and the period of Chazal and Jews who lived in that period. So that's why late antiquity. That's why Tehillim specifically in late antiquity, right? To understand sort of our present, where Tehillim has ended up, right? That's almost the earliest excavation point.
Yeah, and you mentioned the scroll, and it's called in the book a psalter with a P, and that's something that you do kind of get into, kind of like a book culture material Tehillim, even besides for the actual. We're going to really focus on discussing more, and most of the book is focused on Tehillim itself, the words of Tehillim, but you do discuss, you start off and you do focus a little bit on the material aspect of Tehillim.
So we are material creatures, right? The material books that we possess shape the way we read. I'm a scholar. I read a lot of academic books. I hate endnotes. Endnotes are the worst. Footnotes are honestly the best. And I know presses like endnotes because it reduces paper. It's easier on the press. I would read more notes if they were footnotes, right? And that's the nature of having a physical hard copy of a book. Now, imagine trying to do endnotes when you're reading a PDF, right? You got to scroll up and scroll down and scroll up, right? That physical limitation of the book shapes the way as I, a reader, encounters and engages the text. That's also true of the world of Chazal, right? We have to understand that during the times of Chazal, texts for Jews especially were written on scrolls. These days we think of scrolls as kadosh, and they are, because in part where we only see scrolls where Nachi?
Shul.
In shul, right? There's you get the Sefer Torah, you get maybe if in some kilos you get a Haftarah scroll, or Megillat Esther is obvious, and others. But scrolls are sacred. But in the ancient world, that was just par for course. And it's important to understand the scrolls of Tehillim because it helps explain some of its key features and limitations. An entire book of Sefer Tehillim on a scroll would be large and unwieldy. You could not carry that and read that with any. It's about a third of the size of a Sefer Torah. Good luck trying to actually use that on a regular basis. It helps explain why Tehillim starts to exist as, ultimately 5 different, what we call Sfarim, 5 different books, probably existed as 5 different scrolls at one point. It also explains some of the weird features of Sefer Tehillim, right? At the end of each, what we call a Sefer, there's a fancy word coming up, doxology, the Baruch Amen v'Amen, right? Those were sort of endpoints of an actual scroll of Sefer Tehillim. And this division shaped the way Chazal encountered Tehillim. Various pieces of Midrash that talk about the number of the Tehillim and how that relates to interpretation. What did Chazal have available to them? Just one book or all 5? Is Sefer Tehillim 1 book or 5 books?
Yeah, and I think what's also, you mentioned there, like the Mizmarim, I think people probably familiar, but not necessarily. You always think of, you always have, you're in Chumash or any whatever, Sefer Nach, what Perek and Pasuk. But the Perek, Prakim, as we know, it didn't exist. That's a later thing. It's a Christian thing. But Mizmarim and Tehillim, we have a discussion in Chazal, but it did exist. That's a much earlier thing. So that's very different than what, that does exist. And there's the questions in Chazal, and there's Machlekes, and we'll get into this. How many Mizmarim Tehillim are there? Really, where's the break in all of them? And as you discussed, the Sifrei Tehillim. But we'll get into that. Let's start off. I think we should start off at kind of the beginning. Who is the author of Tehillim? Obviously, Chazal talk about this, and we know David HaMelech, but that's so to speak, almost the simplistic version of it. Go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. So we begin with the phrase "Ein somchim al Agadah," or as we would translate that, two Jews, 30 different opinions. But to really understand what's going on with Sefer Tehillim, we have to actually understand what do we mean by an author, right? The idea of the author, right, as this sort of romantic figure who is sitting on a desk and writing with a pen. Right? That's like really, really, really modern, right? In the times of Chazal, you would define this sort of creative activity with two words that are extremely hard to translate. At best, you got katav, right, which means to write, but it could also mean have commission to write, or to copy down, or possibly the word amar, to say, or to compose, or to repeat, or to transmit. Pretty vague words. So when we're talking about an author, we have to have a far more flexible sense of what it means to have a claim, to have an authorship on a particular book. And within Chazal, there are multiple opinions with regards to David HaMelech. The most radical, I think, or the most totalizing, is that of Rabbi Meir in Bavli Shabbat. Right? Rabbi Meir says, based on the line in Psalm 72, Kalu Tfilot David ben Yishai, which would translate as the prayers of David ben Yishai are ended. According to Rav Meir, Al Tikri Kalu, don't read Kalu, Ela Kol Elu, all of these. In which case, in his view, all Mizmorim, right? That's the opinion that we've eventually come to adopt as, seemingly standard. But the truth is, Rav Meir is actually talking about something pretty radical, right? The phrase Kalu Tfilot David ben Yishai appears in Psalm 72. Not 14 Mizmorim later, you actually have a koteret, a title, that begins with Tfilah David ben Yishai. Right? He actually has to reinterpret that. And so that's on the far extreme. But there are other medial positions. There's the famous brayta in Bavli Baba Batra that claims, David HaMelech katav Sefer Tehillim al yedei asara zekenim. He wrote Sefer Tehillim by the means of whatever al yedei is, and that's complicated. 10 elders, and they're all, Adam, Moshe, Haman, Yetudun, all the way back. And that's sort of a medial position, right? Namely, David didn't write all the Mizmorim. He's sort of a compiler, an editor. He had a final gushpanka. Then further still, you have a brayta, a midrash in Shir Hashirim Rabbah, which claims that actually David is merely one of 10 authors, the furthest author being Ezra, right? Because there are a bunch of Mizmorim that seem difficult at first glance to actually put in the words of David, right? Al Naharos Bavel, it's a good one. The other one that we say before benching, Shir Malo B'Shuva Adonai Shivat Zion, Hayinu Chomim. These are Mizmorim that seem to historically preclude David's voice. Now, option number one, Nevuah, right? And that's precisely what Rav Sajigon would do and others. Or, right, you push it further, right? The final editing happens under the times of, or at least according to Chazal, the Anshe Knesset Hagadola. So leaves open the question, but why do we still identify Tehillim with David? And the Midrash has a fascinating and important line. Kach b'sha'ah shebikshu asarat tzadikim lomar sefer Tehillim, amar lehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, kulchem ne'imim v'chasidim u'meshubachim lomar himnon lefanai, ela David yomar al yedei kulchem, lama shekalo orev. Or in short, yes, of course, Tehillim is said by multiple different people, but why David? Because honestly, he's the best. He's the sweetest. Shekolo arev. So there is actually a panoply of views and opinions, even within Chazal, about the authorship, or let's not even use that word, the responsibility for bringing Sefer Tehillim into existence.
So as you mentioned a lot of the opinions about Sefer Tehillim. I'm just looking here in a Beis Chiyun. I was thinking about this Beis Chiyun. The Rebbe of the Barbanel, Lisbon, Portugal, has a commentary on Tehillim. It was redone by Masar of Cook. And he goes through 10 different things in the beginning. It's interesting just to note. And he does, he goes to who wrote it, and he says David HaMelech. And the second thing that he says is, Miu asher diba v'himsi mizmor sefer zeh v'zeh k'aval b'she David kosfu lo yigzor zeh shehu Hashem timamorov. And he says that doesn't mean that he's the one who it came from. He's just the editor. Kisei for Mishlei kosfu Chizkiah v'siyati v'dvaravim divrei Shlomo. Chizkiah wrote. He says Chizkiah did Mishlei, but it was Shlomo Melech. Yeshaya also Chizkiah, and he goes through and he starts bringing all the different Zakanim, and he goes. There's a lot of coming from the Gemara of Basra. He's coming from. But yeah, I mean, really, there's a lot of different opinions on was it David HaMelech or not David HaMelech, and then that's first of all, and then there's also stylistically about Sefer Torah. You mentioned Ruach HaKodesh, Nevuah. If it was Nevuah, then what's it doing in Ksuvim? That's the old issue.
That's the classic.
It's the old issue you have with Daniel. The Gemara Megillah says that Daniel wasn't a Navi. Abarbanel
says he was a Navi. So therefore, you go back and forth. Is it only about the future? Is it prophecy versus Manazes? That's what the Meiri says. It's very. It leaves open a bunch of, but all of these issues, at least for Sefer Tehillim and the authors, go back to one pesky letter. That's the Lamed, right? One of the unique features, more unique features, specifically about Sefer Tehillim, is the Ketorot, the titles, right? Lamed Natseach Mizmor LiDavid, and also you have Alish Shlomo, right? So, what does that mean, right there? We're sort of trained to think of Lamed as 2 or 4. But the truth is, it carries a lot of weight, right? It could mean to David, for David, about David, in the style of David. And in fact, Chazal have a lot of fun creating midrashim that play around that lamed. One of which is actually a hidden midrash right in our Shabbos davening. This is right after El Adon, right? Zeh shavach shel yom hashvi'i shabo shavat el mikol melachto. Right, that's just the beginning. This is the operative line here. V'yom hashabat mishabeach v'omer mizmor shir liyom hashabat tov lohodot ladonai. Right, so in our very Sidur, there is a pseudo midrash that says mizmor shir liyom hashabat. Who is saying that shir? Shabbat. Right, Shabbat's the one who is saying that mizmor shir liyom hashabat. Of course, it's not Shabbat, at least authorially. But that's the point, right? That Lamed does a lot of different things, and need not be reduced to Mizmor Shir. Mizmor LeDavid means that David wrote this.
Yeah, so that's another thing about it, and also other things with Tehillim as well is the singing of Tehillim, and we'll get into more of this. Singing Tehillim is something that was sung. Tehillim is something that they used instruments for. Rabbi Chiyun is very busy with it. He talked about there's many different kli zemer that were mentioned here in the Sefer, and then they would use it. They would use the different, and we'll talk about the Beis HaMikdash and the Shir Shel Yain there as well. And I think, we can go a bunch of different ways here, but just to talk about Tehillim. And, you talk about late antiquity in the book, and this is something that we should get into here is, so when does Tehillim today, as you mentioned, is such an integral part of our lives? Every time, besides for, like you were saying, your mother, and people say Tehillim, and my mother also says Tehillim, she says all the time, goes through the whole Tehillim. My father says Tehillim. I guess this is like a standard thing. But is also in davening. Everything we say in davening, everything, the whole davening, is Tehillim. And so... Only if you're a Karaite. I know what you mean, Nachim, but I'm just making a joke. When does Tehillim really come into davening? Let's go back. What happened Bizman Beis HaMikdash? Where is Tehillim in the daily liturgy? And then how does that, how do we end up where we are now?
Excellent. So, with regards to Bizman Beit HaMikdash, there we go for tongue twisters right there. There are actually a bunch of ways to parse the question, right? There's what's happening in the Mikdash and what's happening around the Mikdash. Internal evidence to Sefer Tehillim suggests, right, that some of the poems that exist in Sefer Tehillim were probably sung in, around, or in relationship to the Beit HaMikdash, right? The number of times the psalmist, the Baal HaMizmor, talks about offering a korban. It suggests that there's some sort of relationship there to the Beit HaMikdash. In the Shir HaMa'alot, which we actually had a little bit of a discussion of, the large, one large opinion is these are actually Ma'alot, referring not to staircases or elevation, but to pilgrimage psalms. A number of these Mizurim refer back to the experience of going Aliyah, right? Or in this case, not to Eretz Yisrael per se, or some of them, but to the Beit HaMikdash itself. It's hard to pin down exactly which, exactly why, exactly when. But there seems to be at least some relationship to some of the Mizmorim in Sefer Tehillim to the Beit HaMikdash. Now, what about like the statutory tefillot of the Beit HaMikdash? During Bayit Sheni, I think it's fairly clear that some of the Mizmorim were actually sung in the Beit HaMikdash as part of the Korban Tamid. We don't really know which ones per se on a regular basis. Chazal have opinions and offers, and this may be the Shir Shel Yom, right? At least for the Beit HaMikdash, where there were particular Mizmorim that were associated with particular days. Bizman sheBeit HaMikdash haya kayam. What's important about late antiquity, and this is a radical claim, is that once the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, it was not intuitive for Chazal, for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and others, to move wholesale the Mizmorim from the Beit HaMikdash to the Amidah, right, to Tefillah. Tehillim only become part of the Amidah, and ultimately part of our larger Tefillah experience much later. Not very specifically during the Tannaitic period, right, 270 to 200, a little bit starting to grow in the Amoraic period, and then it explodes during the times of the Gonim. We can discuss each layer on its own accord.
So you mentioned the Churban Beis Hamikdash, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Chazal. So what happens after that? You mentioned the Beis Hamikdash Shir Shel Yom. So then by Tanaim, we already see in the Mishnah, we start talking about Halal, we're talking about fast days. What do we see in the Tanaim where we see for sure that Tehillim is coming into the davening or the daily liturgy that we see it? You see that
for sure. So let me first backtrack a bit and talk about the Shir Shel Yom, which is the strange thing, right? The intuitive claim is, after our tefillah today, we have a Shir Shel Yom, which is, what the Mishnah and the end of Tamid says for the Beit HaMikdash. So of course that should have continued through the times of Chazal, right? It seems intuitive. Two problems. Number one, when the Mishnah talks about Mizmorim, it often, always, at least for things like Shir Shel Yom, talks about it descriptively and not prescriptively, right? These are things that happen in the temple, but unlike, Mesechet Brachot or Mesechet Megillah, right, which tells you, here's when you're supposed to do Kriyat Shema, here's when you're supposed to do Tefillah, i.e. Amidah, here's when you're supposed to and how you're supposed to read the Torah in the Batei Knesiot, right? There is no Mesechet or sub-Mesechet for here's when you're supposed to read Sefer Tehillim. And in fact, it doesn't seem like the Shir Shel Yom became a standard part of Jewish Tefillah until much, much later, until well into the medieval period. Seder of Amram Gaon, which is the earliest Sidur, talks about one saying the Breita, not the actual Mizmorim. And the Rambam Sidur, which, if anyone's interested, it's in the back of his Sefer Ava, is actually pretty explicit, right? He has this line, V'nahagu miksat ha'am likro b'chol yom achar tachnunim elu, Shir Mizmor shahayu haleviim umrim beveit hamikdash ba'oto hayom. The important part here is note what he says. V'nahagu miksat ha'am, right? A small portion or a portion of the population says the Shir Shel Yom, right? It didn't become standard practice until well into the medieval period, which throws further relief on what you said, Nachi, right? The stuff that does appear in the Mishnah and in the Tosefta, and that's Halal and the fast days, right? These were two sets of psalms, two sets of psalmody that were part of the standard liturgical repertoire, let's call it, in the Tannaitic period, but they have a particular explanation. Both do not belong to the Beit HaMikdash. The fast day ritual, the fast day Mizmorim, many of which, by the way, are actually still, unfortunately, relevant today, right? The Esa Einai El Haharim, and Batzara Ta Li Karati Va'aneni, Mima Makim Karaticha Adonai. If these Mizmorim sound familiar, especially today, unfortunately, right, they have a long and storied history that go back to a much earlier times of distress, namely fasts and the lack of rain. But these were that was a community ritual, right? It didn't center around the Beit Mikdash. It actually centered around the Rechov Ha'ir, right? As we learn in Masechet Tanit. The Hallel, likewise, right? The Hallel is actually the backbone of not festival liturgy, although it becomes that, but actually Pesach the Haggadah. It's among the earliest parts of the Haggadah, and in fact, at least according to Chazal, right, it was performed in the background. This is Mishnah Pesachim, as the sacrifices were being slaughtered for the Korban Pesach. And if there's one thing we know about the Korban Pesach is it's a Korban, but it's not your standard korban, right? It's amami, right? It's communal. There's a whole set of, you don't need the priests for the korban pesach. It's different. It actually explains, by the way, our practice, which goes back to the Mishnah, of splitting halal in the Haggadah, right? This is, machloket b'sham v'telal and pesachim, but we still do this today, where we say half of halal in the beginning of Magid, and then at the end, we say the other half, which always struck me as weird, until you realize that what we're trying to do is recreate the Korban Pesach bismanenu, right? The Hallel was the acoustic backdrop of the Korban Pesach, so you actually bracket your Magid with the Hallel because it's actually liturgical simultaneity, right? In text, we can't do two things at once. It's just, we're human. So we do the first half of Hallel, the meal and everything associated with it, in the second half of Hallel. But one should imagine, as one's doing Magid and eating your food, the Hallel in the background, right? So both the Hallel and the fast day liturgy are both fundamentally non-temple, right? They're the parts of Psalms that entered into sort of daily practice, right? And that's the stuff that stuck around, even after the temple's destroyed. And that's really the ikar of where you find Sefer Tehillim in Tannaitic times, right, during the times of the earliest of Chazal.
Yeah, it's funny, but we're most used to Hallel today. You said Yom Tov and also Rosh Chodesh, and Rosh Chodesh is decidedly a later thing. That's Babylonian, Bavel. That comes much later. So let's talk about Amoraim, where that's really the rise of Tehillim, and the real use in davening comes from the Amoraim. We start seeing this in the Gemara and that whole period.
Yeah, so it starts in the Amoraic periods. We're dealing 200 to 600 thereabout. Putting exact dates on anything is fairly complicated in the ancient world. But it seems to begin in sort of just a trickle, a little bit of a flow. So for example, you have a Memra in the name of Rav Yossi Atzidoni talking about Rav Yochanan Haya Omer, what we say today, Adonai Sevatai Tiftach at the beginning, and Adonai Tzuri V'Goali at the end. Then, of course, there's Rav Yehuda, who would say both of them at the end. So you begin with the earliest of the Amoraic period, where you have some members of Chazal putting in some mizmor or some psukim, right, from Tehillim into their tefillah. As time goes on, the practice begins to develop and move further. You actually see it most forcefully in the Stama de Gemara, right? Because Rav Yochanan, B'chvodo, potentially, maybe, possibly may have made not a mistake, I wouldn't say that, raised a problem by saying Adonai Sefatai Tiftach Ufi Agitiatecha before his Amidah, right? And what's that problem? We have an inyan, right? An idea of being somech, Geula L'Tfila, right? When you say Gaal Yisrael, you're supposed to immediately move on to the Amidah. So the Gemara asks, okay, but what about Psukim? What about Adonai Sefatai Tiftach? That's a problem. That should break Geula Tefillah. The answer that the Gemara gives is, well, Tiknu Rabbanan, right? The rabbis established it as part of the Amidah, Tefillah Arichta, right? It's actually all part of the Amidah. So you actually see in that period of time between Rav Yochanan and the Stama de Gemara, you see a rise in practice of some people are saying some Psalms or some Psukim from Tehillim as voluntary to, no, actually there's an established practice that we now say at least some Psukim as part of Tefillah. And you see this evidence of some more Psukim getting in from Piyut. There are certain sections of Piyut that are always going to have a pasuk from something which you would then extrapolate that existed as part of your regular Amidah. And it's also towards the sort of end of this period where we actually have our first full Mizmor, what we know as Ashrei, right? Because the Gemara, well, it's really Tila David, 145. Ashrei is the opening and concluding psukim for 145. But the Gemara specifically asks, Lama again, based on Rabbi Yochanan, lama, wish I had the quote, why is there no, what happened to the nun in Ashrei, right? Which isn't the question, right? The real question is what happened to nun in Tila David, right? The fact that they're calling it Ashrei presupposes that it's talking about some sort of liturgical unit that begins with psukim from Ashrei and whose core was Tila David, right? So by the beginning of the, by the middle towards the end of the Amoraic period, you're really starting to see the, Reshit Smichat, if I can say that in this podcast, the beginnings of Tehillim making their way into liturgy, and then it sort of snowballs. And by the time you get to Seder of Amram Gon, it's really recognizable. There are Tehillim everywhere.
Why don't you say the quote of Jerome? And well, we should explain Jerome, early church father, lives in Israel, and you should. Yeah, so what Jerome has this quote, and he talks about how common it was for all Jews to be saying Tehillim.
Yes, well, how common it was for everyone. That's all right. So, but before we actually talk about Jerome's quote, let's just talk a little bit about Jerome. Jerome was a father of the early church. He's a major, massive, important figure. He lived sometime between 342 and 420 CE, so he's smack in the middle of the Amoraic period. What's important for Jerome, in addition to the fact that he translated the Tanakh from Hebrew to Latin, which became the standard translation for the Catholic Church, was that he eventually found his way to Beit Lechem, as you know, is in Eretz Yisrael. And more than that, Jerome certainly talked to other Jews and possibly even members of Chazal. If you read carefully through Jerome's commentaries, he'll quote sources that you can start to correlate with stuff in Chazal. He'll often say, and I consulted the Jews, and they said, he's acting, as polemical and as Christian as he was. There seems to have been an active observing of people around him, both obviously members of his own religion, but also Jews, which is why it's interesting when Jerome, in one of his letters that he's writing back to Rome, says, and here I quote, "But certainly, as we have said above, all the rustic villages are silent except for psalmody. Wherever you turn, the cultivator holding the plow sings hallelujah, the sweating reaper distracts himself with psalms, and the vineyard worker trimming grapes with a pruning knife chants something from David. So, again, I think it's a little bit hyperbolic, it's a little bit idyllic, but I think it still gets the point across that Jerome hears Sefer Tehillim and the sound of Sefer Tehillim as the acoustic backdrop of life in Eretz Yisrael. And that's pretty amazing. It's part of that acoustic backdrop that begins to account for why Sefer Tehillim starts to make inroads into Jewish prayer and practice during late antiquity. But there are others that we should talk about.
Yeah, and that question is why?
Why? That's like the $1 million question. So there are, let's call it 3 broad factors: internal, proximal, and distal. Nothing comes from, everything is yesh me'yesh unless you're a Kadosh Baruch Hu who's creating the world, and then maybe we can talk about yesh me'ayin. But part of the reason why Sefer Tehillim became more liturgical and then more used in practice has to actually do with an innovation of Chazal, and that is the Amidah itself, right? The Amidah is the quintessential rabbinic prayer. I mean, it was Misader by Shimon Apakuli and the Anshe Knesset Agadola, according to Bavli Megillah. But in order to establish the Amidah as something central and significant, Chazal very often relied on interpreting Sefer Tehillim as a means of rhetorically justifying the Amidah. So, for example, why are there 18 brachot in the Amidah? And this is like one of the earliest Tannaitic sources that we have about the Amidah, because of the 18 mentions of the name of Hashem in Psalm 29. That's Habu Adonai b'nei Elim. Sefer Tehillim is used to imagine the structure of the Amidah. So in Yerushalmi brachot, it explicitly claims that the Amidah is 18 brachot, which corresponds keneged the 18 mizmorim from the beginning of Sefer Tehillim until the Ancha Adonai B'Yom Tzara, which is Psalm 20, but that's where we get 1 and 2, and that's the whole number of mizmor questions that we'll talk about later. So what ultimately, one factor is rhetoric becoming reality, right? The constant use of Sefer Tehillim to justify prayer, right? To show that what we're doing as prayer is scripturally based, eventually makes inroads in which Tehillim itself becomes prayer proper. And this is also true for another form of Tehillim that becomes really popular in the Amoraic period, and that's the Petichta. Right, so you go to shul on a Shabbat, and your pulpit rabbi gets up there, and for the most part, they begin with something like, "In this week's parsha, Rashi said." Right, that's the standard opening for a drasha. Well, in the times of the Amorim, there was a standard opening for a drasha. It's called the Petichta. Right, patach means open. It would begin with a random verse, often from Ketuvim. You would interpret that verse, and eventually, after 20 minutes, an hour, hopefully not, you would get to a piece of Parsha on the first pasuk of the Sedra of the week. 1/3 of all Petichtot come from Sefer Tehillim. It's predominant. So it's possible another internal factor is the use of Sefer Tehillim as part of shul drashot encourage Sefer Tehillim and its psukim to become part of shul proper, the liturgy. So that's what I would call an internal change, right? Change no one just drops a dime and everything changes, right? There are factors that come from the inside. There are also proximal factors, right? Factors that are related to the environment in which Chazal are operating. And the one of the most important is art and architecture, right? We are where we pray, right? What we pray or where we pray can say a lot about us. So during the times of that Maoraim, there was actually a shift in shul architecture. The earliest of shuls kind of looked like a community center, a big box, and you would do everything there, right? You pray there, you would Torah there, you'd have your communal meetings there. During the times of the Maoraim, the shuls that were built and renovated tended to focus on tefillah, on trying to actually become models of something like a temple. And you see this specifically with synagogue art. Have you talked about mosaics here yet?
I actually have not talked about mosaics, even though it's very interesting. I mean, you have in the front picture of your book, a lot of these books have like mosaics and a couple of the famous ones, but I didn't talk about them. No.
Right. So you should, because mosaics are cool and fun. But for example, the shul in Sipori, right, has a whole host of mosaics that depict not just Jewish life, but also the Beit HaMikdash, right? It's in this, you have the Kior, you have Aaron, you have menorah, and the incense shovel. There seems to be a slow shift in mentality among Jews in general, in Eretz Yisrael at least, that slowly reconceptualizes the Beit HaKnesset as what we now take it for granted as, which is a Mikdash Ma'at, right? That didn't happen immediately. That happened slowly and largely and really came to a fever pitch in the Amoraic period. So one can imagine once you're starting to analogize the shul as temple, you start to incorporate other elements from the Beit HaMikdash, such as Sefer Tehillim, right? The liturgy of the temple itself. The other proximal factor is the porous boundaries between piety and liturgy. Right, sort of half of our davening today, or half of what we think of as chovah in davening today, is actually not at all chovah. These were pieces of tefillah that were at once reshut and then eventually became, after a period, chovah. Alinu l'shabeach, and all the mizmorim after, right? We're actually late medieval. People would optionally say them, and then eventually they became part of liturgy itself. And that happened for Tehillim as well. That's probably what happened with Ashrei, right? On that same daf in Brachot, you have a line. This is Kol ha'omer Tehillah LeDavid, and this is the Girsa in the Dafus says Shalosh Pa'amim B'chol Yom. Muftach lo shehu ben olam haba. Anyone who says Tehillah David 3 times a day it's a promise for them that they're ben olam haba, right? So, which makes sense, right? 3 times we say Ashrei 3 times in our tefillah. But if you actually look at the Kisvei Yad, it says b'chol yom. The shlosh is actually later, right? It seems to be the case that there was an early practice of saying Psalm 145 mistam, right, as a nice thing to do, as piety, and eventually, right, as we learn a little later, right, it becomes Ashrei, right? And it moves into tefillah. And then as time went on, as the Sofrim that were copying the Gemara saw that line, they were like, wait a second, we don't say Ashrei or Tefillah David one time. We say it 3, so they updated the text in that case for 3 times. So there was a larger culture of piously reciting psalms, and some of those eventually made their way into Tefillah. And finally, like now we're back full circle to Jerome, right? It is a truth that we are to some degree products of our environment, whether we are happy or whether we are resistant to it. But the fact that Christians were using Sefer Tehillim as a central feature in this period of Tefillah, the monks would say it once a day entirely. Christian populations in their churches would say it regularly. Created an atmosphere, as you read from Jerome, that encouraged Sefer Tehillim to become part of Tefillah.
So there's a couple more things that we have to get to, we didn't touch on. We teased it a couple times. Let's actually first go to how many Mizmarim. I mean, I mentioned before how Prakim is in Tanakh was till later, but Mizmarim, there's different opinions. Some people are familiar with the beginning, the first 2, but talk a little bit about that and the different opinions in Chazal about that.
Absolutely. So the first thing that I want to stress is when we're talking about Sefer Tehillim during the times of Chazal and the number of Mizmorim, we're not talking the texts had the same content, right? In a little bit earlier in Qumran, and we're talking Bayit Sheni period, there are certain scrolls from the Dead Sea Scrolls that have Tehillim or things that we would consider Tehillim that don't appear in our Sefer Tehillim. We're not talking about that, right? We're talking about the number of Mizmorim according to an academic term, the Masoretic text, right? Namely, the text of our proper Sefer Tehillim. And it varies. If you look at the medieval manuscripts of Sefer Tehillim, it goes anywhere between 143 to 154. The 2 Memrod in Chazal that are essential here. The first actually alludes to one of the things I mentioned earlier in Brachot 9b, where it tries to correlate the Amidah, which has 18, of course 19, but in their conception 18 Brachot, with the number of the Mizmorim from the Rosh Shel Tehillim until Yancha Adonai B'Yom Tzara, which is Psalm 20. And the line here actually is Amar Rabbi Yehuda B'Rei Rav Shimon ben Pazi, Ho'il v'lo amaro David ela la'achar shmona esrei parshiot lefikach takinu rabanan la'achar shmona esrei brachot. This refers to the line Yirotzon Imrei fi v'hegyon li bilefanecha, right? Because David said it after shmona esrei parshiot, so too Chazal said the same pasuk after shmona esrei brachot, which then leads the Gemara to say, okay, but what about like there are 19, not 18. And so they combine 1 and 2 with the argument that, any Mizmor that begins with Ashrei, Ish, Asher, and then ends with Ashrei is really 1 Mizmor. So there's a long tradition of at least combining Psalm 1 and 2. There's another tradition of combining Psalms 9 and 10, because together they form a kind of broken acrostic, right? It's an alphabetic pattern, Aleph Bet, so 9 and 10 get merged. The smaller number actually appears in both the Yerushalmi and in Breshit Rabbah, where it claims that the 147 Mizmorim correspond to the life of Yaakov Avinu. So you can see that someone probably had a Mizmor, a set of Tehillim that had 147 and needed to explain it. Why 147? Where does 147 appear as significant in our tradition? Yaakov, right? So it becomes connected to Yaakov Avinu. But the truth is, these Mizmorim get chopped up in different ways. Psalm 117, right? Which is like really, really, really short. You might know it from Hallel, right? Gets combined with 118 or sometimes 116 and 118. So there are actually many ways to chop it up. It's not until the rise of print and the first rabbinic Bible where we start to have like really 150, period.
Right, and like you said, it's really the kapitlach of Tehillim, is what we're talking about. The content of Psukkah Tehillim, the actual words of Tehillim are the same. Yeah, and that was good that you made that clear. I think that was clear, but just to clarify that. So now that's the other part of talking about Tehillim. I mentioned there's the music and the musician, and the instrument. I'm interested in Rabbi Chiyon's comment. It's fascinating. He discusses a lot of this, but also Tehillim as poetry. And that has to do with the origins of Tehillim also as an oral thing versus written down, and Tehillim as poetry and the repetitiveness. There's a lot of different things about that aspect of Tehillim.
Yeah, and this is why this actually goes like full circle to our author question, right? We can't think of Sefer Tehillim as this, book that one person sat down and then just penned in one sitting, or over a lifetime, as closed, signed, sealed, delivered. Tehillim is oral poetry. It's kind of like jazz to some degree, right? There are key motifs that get played again and again, but in different variations. It's why you have, in my more cynical moods, right? It's why when I read Tehillim very carefully, it's like, okay, didn't we just say this? Didn't we just wait? Didn't he just vanquish his enemy? Why is the enemy back? Right? It's why you actually can't read Sefer Tehillim as a narrative, because everything keeps happening again and again and again. And this is also true for the very words of Sefer Tehillim, not just sort of the large scale ideas. So for example, lines like, this sounds familiar. Again, I like picking on Hallel. Mekim me afardal me ashpot yarim evyon. Right? That sounds like the end of 113, right? But what if I read the same pasuk just a little differently? Well, now I'm reading the prayer of Chana in Shmuel Aleph. By the way, the Shmuel Aleph Shmuel Bet thing. Yeah, that also goes back to.
It's just Shmuel.
It's just Shmuel.
That is Christian.
Just Shmuel.
Out, get rid of that. That is not. Yeah, that's not real.
And it goes back to scroll culture, right?
Yeah.
A full copy of Sefer Shmuel, right? It would be huge, right? So it's not.
There's supposed to be just Shmuel.
It's just Shmuel. Yeah. So again, you find not only lines, but entire mizmorim elsewhere. So Sefer Divrei Yamim, which by the way is one of the most fascinating books of Tanakh, and everyone here should read it. If you have to skip the first 12 chapters, which are just names, I could be Michael, but it's fun. But if you read the story of David bringing the Aron from Oved Edom, there's an entire mizmor there in Parak Tet Vav, Tet Zayin. And in fact, it's really just a combination of 105, 1 to 15, followed by 96, 1 to 13, 106, 1, and 106, 47 to 8, right? These are texts that are being repeated both in rhythm, in terms of ideas. These are texts that are being repeated in line with variation, or even as a whole. In fact, within Sefer Tehillim itself, Psalm 14 and 56, 47 to 8, right? These are texts that are being repeated both in rhythm, in terms of ideas. These are texts that are being repeated in line with variation, or even as a whole. In fact, within Sefer Tehillim itself, Psalm 14 and 53 are almost the exact same mizmor, right? If you're writing the same book, what are the odds? Well, if you're writing a book from beginning to cover, what are the odds of you putting in the exact same chapter with some minor differences, right? All of this goes back to sort of the oral nature of Israelite poetry, right? These aren't being said at one moment and then committed to writing. These are living poems, right? They're being said again and again, and they're changing, and they change each time. Eventually, someone writes them down, or at least someone records them down. But it's actually quite it's living poetry, which kind of explains, if you read Sefer Tehillim carefully, all the calls to Zamru Shir Chadash or Shir Chadasha. Like, what does that mean? Well, if you read Tehillim, you know what that means, right? It means compose another mizmor like this mizmor, right? Use this mizmor or things like it to do more. So yeah, it's if we really want to understand Sefer Tehillim, we have to understand the oral nature of ancient Israelite poetry.
Now, as we get towards the end, well, you said before we came full circle, and I really come full circle, as you mentioned that your mother used to always say Tehillim every day, and that really comes to part of what you discussed at the end of, which is piety and magic in Tehillim. And you talk about the Christian and the Jewish sources. So talk a little about that.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is one of the things about Sefer Tehillim and its use that truly fascinated me. And again, goes back to my mother, right? Like, the liturgy is important. My mother obviously prayed, but she used Tehillim as a vector of meaning, right? She really used it for skula, for parnasa, for magic, for piety. Like that's sort of what really got me interested in Sefer Tehillim. I'll do the wrong thing as a historian and go in reverse chronology, which is horrible because we start at the beginning and we end at the end. But the use of Sefer Tehillim as magic and piety. And let me just be clear, by magic, I don't mean hocus pocus. I mean the ritual use of a text that we understand as kadosh to have both internal effects, sociological effects, and, effects on heaven, right? This isn't, worshiping another god, chas v'shalom. But the ikar of it really, it becomes a thing during the Middle Ages, where we start to use Tehillim for all sorts of things. So Psalm 20 is Yancha Adonai b'yom tzara, which has become a theme of our conversation. Right? It has 9 psukim, and it's used regularly to for helping during childbirth, because 9 psukim, 9 months. Psalm 119, which we didn't talk about, right? The Timnei Apeh, the longest text in Tanakh, receives regular usage. There's I think still a pious custom today to spell out your name at the end of Shemona Esrei, so that when you go to Shemayim, you'll actually you'll know your name and you'll be able to record it to the Malach. But it was used for plague remedies. So you'd spell out the name of your city during times of tsaras. All of this goes back to a larger literature called Sefer Shimush Tehillim, the book of the use of Psalms. And this, it goes Mizmor by Mizmor, and it tries to tell you, right, Mizmor Aleph, this is what you can use it for. So for example, Mizmor Aleph, some of it is what we might call healing. So the first Mizmor is about preventing a nefel, stillbirth. Some of it's kind of truly what we would consider magic. Hine lo yanum v'lo yishan, you would say it to escape the guards and be invisible. Some of it's just self-help, right? Psalm 131, Adonai lo gava libi, right? You would say it again and again so that you stop becoming haughty. And some of it was truly liturgical. You would, according to Sefer Shimush Tehillim, say the final psalm if you wanted to kivein et libo lakadosh baruch Hu, right? To set your heart to God and His greatness. So this literature of Sefer Shimush Tehillim, this listing of Sefer of uses of psalms, became really important in the Middle Ages, and it has its roots during the times of Chazal. So, for example, in Bavli Psachim, if you want to drink potable water, there's demons inhabit water on certain days, but on the days that demons do inhabit water, you can just say the Sheva Kolot, which is Psalm 29, Havel Adonai ben Elim, over the water, and you would then be able to drink it. So you start to see these echoes of Psalms in late antiquity. There was a whole culture of creating kameot, amulets, both in terms of silver amulets you would wear or incantation bowls. These you can see in the museum, they're amazing. Kind of like a Kellogg's bowl with writing around. You would bury it in the front door, and a demon would come and then get sucked under the bowl and be unable to escape. A number of these bowls quote psukim from Sefer Tehillim, because words have power. Kodesh, right? Sifrei Kodesh have power. And Tehillim stands out as the most used. So you would find inscriptions of Tehillim, like Psalm 29 again, Havel Adonai ben Elim, Adonai al Mayim Rabim, you would find that over cisterns, over buildings, you would have other psukim. So there seems to be this larger culture, especially during that period, late antiquity, in which we begin to see the use of Tanakh overall, but Tehillim specifically to affect your environment, to affect your external environment and your internal environment. So it's sort of the seeds begin in the ancient world and then flourish until our modern.
All right, listen, I think that, first of all, there's more to discuss here, and there's your book, which I'll put the link in the show's notes for those interested in purchasing that. You have a number of articles, kind of more popular articles. I can link to some of those in the show's notes as well for anyone interested in reading them. And again, the book, there's more there. A lot of what we discussed here, you go more in depth even on the scroll aspect of things, the book culture, and we discussed that, and a lot of different aspects. And hopefully this was interesting for listeners to hear a little bit about Tehillim. It's something that, something that we interact with on a daily basis, countless times. And it's really important to, understand Tehillim and to learn about Tehillim. And thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Nachi. This is a real pleasure.